You're laughing at $200. It's what she left you, my cousin smirked. Read the rest, the lawyer said, hand on the folder. There is no rest, my aunt said. I kept my voice steady and let the room breathe. The notarized letter attached to the will would speak. The mantle clock ticked once as if counting my patience. Stay, let the documents speak first. Laughter bounced off the paneled walls, then thinned under the ceiling vents were. I touched the envelope's stiff edge to make sure it was real. Fluorescent light washed the conference table flat and unforgiving. We were in the back room of a small-town attorney's office. Folding chairs scraped as cousins shifted, waiting for numbers and titles. The lawyer, Mr. Warren, rested 2 fingers on the manila folder. It's simple, said a cousin leaning back like a judge. 200 is a joke, another added, too pleased with himself. I counted one inhale, then another. The letter's blue notary stamp showed through the ivory envelope. It had the same clean scent as copy paper after a fresh stack opens. The will sat on the table in ordered pages and sticky flags. My name appeared near the bottom, bracketed by neat initials. $200, they said, like a cashier's sigh after coins drop. I remembered helping her pay for home repairs, no questions asked. I remembered rides to appointments and bank lobbies with humming printers. None of that mattered to the room right now. Community rooms remember voices more than deeds. People want the curtain call, not the rehearsal. Today they wanted theater produced on a schedule. Mr. Warren cleared his throat low and even. He tapped the envelope, then rested his palm on it. The mantle clock ticked again, a metronome for patience. 5 sentences settle a frame in my mind. Community office, fluorescent tubes humming above us. I slid the envelope 2 inches nearer my seat. If they shouted more, the date and stamp would refuse. My jaw unclenched slowly. Let's proceed, Mr. Warren said, voice careful but firm. Proceed to what? My aunt asked, pretending confusion. He arranged the will so everyone could see the title page. The paper rasped in a way only legal paper does. I could feel the cool edge against my fingertips, square and sure. We'll read in order, he said, and then address attached instruments. A letter isn't an instrument, someone muttered from the back. It is when it changes terms, he replied without looking up. A cousin fanned herself with a church program, stirring cologne and dust. Another tapped a pen too fast for the silence to swallow. The air smelled faintly of Lysol, clean and officious. I watched the faces that used to mean holidays and casseroles. Some avoided my eyes completely, as if my glance carried bills. Some looked at me like a stranger who borrowed the family name. It's still insulting, said the pen tapper, eyes sliding away. Maybe she forgot to add a 0, another cousin laughed. It would have been easy to answer and win nothing. I held the envelope like a rail on a moving bus. The fluorescent panels flickered once, buzzing like a tired neon sign. Mr. Warren read the first clauses crisp and unhurried. He described bequests to charities and small gifts to neighbors. He paused before my line, then looked up across his glasses. For the record, he said, a separate notarized letter is appended. He placed the ivory envelope in the center of the table. The blue stamp looked like a small moon on clean snow. Why wasn't that red? First an uncle asked, chin raised. Order matters, Mr. Warren said. We finished the will, then attachments. I pressed my thumb against the stamp's raised seal through the paper. The texture steadied me like a bead on a rosary. Air moved from the vent, a soft ribbon against my cheek. Read faster, someone said, impatience slipping into a whine. We have errands, another added. Banks close early. I thought about the mornings I brought her coffee and sat quietly. About the afternoons sorting bills while the copier warmed and clicked. About the way she signed her name like a promise never rushed. Mr. Warren continued, voice smooth like a radio host. He paused for initials and dates, then called for silence when needed. The room settled into an unwilling, uneven attention. $200 echoed like a taunt inside the page margin. I let it sit there exactly where she placed it. I did not change the weight of it with words. She played favorites, the aunt said again, but softer now. Then let the paper show it, Mr. Warren answered. The lawyer turned the final page with 2 careful fingers. He set the will aside and lifted the envelope at last. The room tilted toward him, chairs inching, breath held without agreement. We will read the attached letter in Chapter 2, he said. It clarifies obligations connected to the bequests. Pens stopped moving. The clock ticked once into the pause. I gathered the envelope back to my side steady and slow. The fluorescent light pressed flat shadows around our hands. The paper felt dry as winter skin, patient as a ledger. The copier down the hall clicked like a cautious metronome. I rubbed my thumb along the flap fibers, lifting slightly. Ink smelled metallic, reminding me that records carry weight. I did not need them to like me to hear me. I needed the letter to speak when the order allowed it. The vent sighed and dust motes turned like slow confetti. Tonight's proof is not money but the rule a letter enforces. Within this room it will say who holds keys and duties. Outside this room, boundaries will finally stand in writing. Keep listening, the records begin in chapter 2. Or start inheritance and elder dignity. The laughter had quieted, but its echoes still lingered in my chest. They thought $200 was a slap, not a signal. I sat straighter, remembering every year they ignored me until the work was done. The ivory envelope beside me held more than money. It carried a clause that would not bend to gossip. I remembered summers when the air vents coughed dust and I swept her porch. I remembered fall mornings with coffee percolating, her smile warm but tired. I remembered helping balance her checkbook while others promised visits but never came. The copier in the bank lobby hummed while I waited for her initials. No one saw those afternoons but me. At family gatherings I was often the quiet shadow. Cousins clinked glasses, told stories, praised their promotions. I stacked chairs after dinners, collected coats, rinsed dishes. None of it appeared in the stories they told, yet the memories stuck to me. Their laughter tonight only proved what they had always believed: I was the least. She never said much, but her small thanks lingered like incense. She would hand me receipts, whisper, hold on to these, and I did. She would sign a note and ask me to keep a copy. Those small gestures felt heavier than her jewelry or silverware. The paper told stories no toast could match. Mr. Warren's voice carried on steady as a clock. He read other bequests, sums larger than mine. Their shoulders relaxed, their pens scratched notes, their smiles widened. I stayed silent, holding my envelope. It was both shield and reminder. $200 seemed an insult, but my aunt's eyes betrayed curiosity. She whispered, "Why does it matter? 200 is nothing." A cousin smirked, "Enough for a dinner, maybe." I let their words pass. They didn't know how a letter could lock a door or open one. The air smelled faintly of Lysol and paper dust. The fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead like restless bees. I touched the envelope's corner again, smooth but sharp. That letter held a trigger no one else had guessed. I thought of the day she asked me to take her downtown. She wore her best coat, stiff with mothballs. The notary's office smelled like old books and ink. She signed with a hand that shook but never faltered. "Keep this with you," she said. "Don't read until they laugh." I folded the letter like scripture and tucked it away. The mantle clock ticked again, anchoring me in the present. My cousins shifted chairs, creaking. "Move along," one said, impatient. "Some of us have plans." Mr. Warren lifted his head, calm. "We finish the record in order," he said. "Every page matters." They rolled their eyes. They wanted numbers, not clauses. They wanted inheritance like dessert, not obligations like contracts. But she knew what mattered, and she trusted me with the weight. I replayed the last holiday dinner in her house. She asked me to carve the ham, though my cousins joked. She asked me to check the furnace filter, though others groaned. She handed me the bank slips to file away. Her faith lived in small choices, never announcements. The smell of potluck stew lingered in the hallway that night. I kept her papers folded tight in a plastic sleeve. The cousins now compared amounts like gamblers bragging. "She left me the china set," one said proudly. "I get 5,000, another added, voice bright. Their smiles felt sharp, as if mine was the punchline. My aunt said, "Don't pout, be grateful for the crumbs." I only nodded because words would break the silence I needed. The envelope warmed under my palm. Its weight was light, but the seal carried steel. Every tick of the clock brought us closer to the moment. My jaw tightened, then eased again. Patience is harder than pride, but stronger. Mr. Warren cleared his throat again. "For those who remain impatient," he said, "please note attachments may alter distribution." That word alter hung in the air like a held breath. Some blinked. Some frowned. A cousin whispered alter what, he did not answer yet. I leaned back and let the air vent brush my cheek. Dust motes spun in the light, slow and certain. The smell of old paper clung to the room. My silence was not surrender. It was a pause before sound. 200 is still 200, my aunt pressed. It's insulting. Perhaps Mr. Warren replied, or perhaps it is a condition. That word drew stares narrow and sharp. They wanted details. He smiled thinly and continued reading. I thought of the mornings she signed checks for community donations. She asked me to drive her when others claimed busy schedules. She whispered once, they like to be seen giving. You like to be steady. I carried that line like a stone in my pocket. Tonight the stone would weigh differently. A cousin yawned loud and staged. Another fanned herself with the church program again. The fluorescent buzz seemed louder as patience thinned. I held the envelope tighter, thumb rubbing the seal. It felt like waiting for a storm no one else saw. Why 200? Someone demanded again. Why not nothing? Mr. Warren adjusted his glasses. Because 200 is enough to bind a letter. Less and it would not stand. Murmurs rippled. My aunt's face stiffened, a mask of confusion. I breathed slowly, counting the beats. 1, 2, 3. The mantle clock ticked at 4. Proof sat inches from me, silent but certain. I did not need to argue. The letter would explain. Minnie Hook rose in my mind. They would laugh again before the letter spoke. They would push, prod, insult. But the paper would land louder than voices. That was the rhythm she planned, and I honored it. The smell of coffee from the lobby machine drifted faintly. It mingled with Lysol and paper, a strange comfort. I shifted slightly, the chair's plastic edge biting my leg. These small discomforts reminded me I was still grounded, still waiting. My cousins now debated jewelry, photos, even furniture. They fought over chairs like trophies, ignoring me. I let them. Their greed filled the room like static. I breathed it in, then let it go. My envelope did not change shape or weight. Enough gossip, Mr. Warren said finally. We continue with the last clauses. Then we open the letter. That promise hushed even the loudest. Silence held for a heartbeat. The clock ticked again. I traced the envelope seam once more, fibers rough under my nail. The blue stamp shone faintly under the light. She had trusted me to hold this, not flaunt it. Tonight the room would hear her voice through paper. The will's final lines, past initials and signatures recorded. Mr. Warren stacked the pages carefully. He placed the envelope on top, its ivory cover sharp against the brown wood. He looked around the table, once meeting each face. In the next session, he said, we read the letter. A cousin muttered, about time. But even he leaned closer, curiosity pulling stronger than disdain. I leaned back, exhale, slow, heart even. $200 meant nothing, yet everything. The air vent sighed again, steady as truth. My silence held, but not forever. Keep listening, the clause will speak in chapter 3. The laughter grew louder once the will's main clauses closed. They wanted drama and they found me. $200 had become their joke of the hour. Chairs squeaked as cousins leaned closer, smirking, whispering, then speaking loud enough to sting. The ivory envelope sat near my hand, untouched, still sealed. 200, that's what you give a stranger's babysitter, one cousin crowed. More like a tip left under the salt shaker, another added. Maybe it's for gas money home, an uncle chimed in. Don't spend it all at once, a cousin snorted. Their voices hit me like sleet, sharp, cold, but melting fast. My hands stayed folded on the table. I traced the cool surface with my thumb. The envelope waited square and patient, like a soldier at attention. The air vent whirred again, steady and indifferent. Mr. Warren cleared his throat but let them vent. He shuffled papers slowly, a teacher waiting for noise to subside. I sat in the middle of it, all spine straight, breath even. Inside my chest a truth echoed, the notarized letter would end this. Until then, silence was my only weapon. The mantle clock ticked, marking each insult like a bead on a rosary. I remembered her saying once, let them show their teeth first. Then paper will close the mouth. She trusted me to hold that order. My jaw flexed, then loosened. One cousin leaned forward, waving her pen. What do you think you'll do with that fortune? She asked, voice dripping. I bet she'll frame the check, another laughed. She should buy a used tire, a third cut in. Or split it for fast food, the first added. I looked at the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. My fingers tapped the envelope edge. The paper rasped faintly, a sound I knew better than applause. In silence I heard her voice again. Wait until the room grows sure of itself. Then let the letter breathe. They laughed harder, overlapping voices. The conference table turned into a stage and I was the target. Some slapped the wood for emphasis. One cousin mimed handing me coins, dropping them into a ghost cup. Their cruelty was careless, not creative, but the sting was real. Mr. Warren finally raised his voice. "We have procedures." His tone was even but firmer now. "Procedures don't change $200, someone shot back. "They might," he said, voice flat, eyes sliding toward me. The fluorescent light flickered once. Shadows jumped across the file cabinet. The air smelled faintly of Lysol again, mixed with stale coffee from the lobby. I gripped the envelope like a railing in a storm. My silence grew heavier, not lighter. Peak 1 was forming sharp and loud. They believed the joke was set. They believed I was cornered by $200. I pressed the edge of the envelope against my palm, grounding myself in the roughness of paper. The mantle clock ticked louder, or maybe my ears filled the silence with its beat. Then came the boldest jab yet. "Maybe she left you the trash can too," my aunt smirked. "Perfect for stuffing your receipts," her son added. "Or all the bills you'll never pay," another cousin piled on. "And the family wonders why you're always in the corner," she finished. Their words rolled like a drumbeat, louder, faster. I could feel heat in my chest, but my face remained calm. I inhaled once, exhaled once. $200 meant nothing to them. But the letter, signed, stamped, dated, meant everything to me. It would mean everything to them soon. 5 sentences froze the moment in my mind. "Conference room," fluorescent buzz trembling above. I slid the envelope closer, wood grain brushing my fingertips. If they believed the joke, the seal would not. My jaw tightened, but my voice stayed quiet. "Read it when the order allows," I whispered to myself. Mr. Warren lifted a hand. "That's enough," he said, louder now. His voice carried authority that silence had not. Some cousins rolled eyes but fell back. The laughter died unevenly, replaced with grumbles. The room stilled except for the steady tick and whir. I sat straighter, hands folded over the envelope. Their smirks lingered, but the energy shifted. They had spent themselves filling the room with noise. Now the silence was mine. The blue notary stamp shone faintly under the light, patient, unyielding. "Shall we move on?" Mr. Warren asked. "Move on to what?" my aunt demanded. "To the attachments," he said. "They alter the record." The word alter silenced even the boldest. It dangled like a key no one expected. Eyes turned toward me, suspicion rising. The envelope warmed under my palms, but my voice remained still. The mantle clock ticked again, steady as law. Inside, I rehearsed her words once more. "Patience carries longer than pride." She knew her family. She knew what laughter would cost and what paper could return. Tonight her trust in me was heavier than gold. I would not spoil it with anger. My cousins shifted again, some whispering nervously now. The jokes thinned, replaced by glances at the ivory envelope. Their confidence cracked just slightly. The buzz of fluorescent light filled the gap. The air smelled sharper, ink and Lysol mingling like truth and cleaning. I did not gloat. I did not speak. I held the silence like a ledger, balanced and waiting. $200 was never the whole sum. They would learn that soon. Until then, their laughter was only noise against paper. Peak 1 landed. They had laughed their loudest, and I had not broken. My silence became the loudest voice in the room. The envelope remained unopened, but its power filled every breath. Their mockery echoed, but the echo was fading. Mr. Warren stacked the will neatly, then rested his hand on the envelope. "We will continue with this," he said. The room leaned closer, unwilling to admit curiosity. Their smirks faltered. Their silence deepened. I touched the blue stamp one last time, its texture rough but real. My shoulders eased, my breath slowed. The mantle clock ticked again, and the room listened without meaning to. Laughter had ended. Waiting had begun. Keep listening. Chapter 4 will remind you how silence holds until the paper speaks. When the laughter finally ebbed, it left a hollow quiet in its wake. I sat still, holding the envelope, my fingers pressing the edge until it left a mark. My cousins leaned back in their chairs, their smugness cooling into chatter. They spoke of trips they could take, bills they could pay, gifts they already planned. My name did not appear in their plans except as a punchline. $200 had branded me as the smallest, the least, and they relished it. I let their voices blur, drifting into memory. Years rolled backward like film on a reel. I remembered mornings when the porch rain tapped the roof and I carried groceries to her door. She always looked smaller in her chair, but her eyes remained clear. I would brew coffee on the old percolator, the smell filling her kitchen while she shuffled receipts. She trusted me with her envelopes long before the last one. My cousins never saw those mornings. They arrived with flowers once a year, smiling wide for photographs, then left quickly. I stayed behind washing dishes, folding laundry, driving her to checkups. The grocery neon would buzz while we waited for prescriptions, her hand gripping my arm. She would thank me in whispers as if gratitude might embarrass me. Those whispers meant more than public applause. A cousin laughed loudly, snapping me back. She thought 200 was enough for you, he said. Another added, more than generous considering you never amounted to much. Their words were blunt, careless, but I had heard worse before. Their contempt had been steady company for years. What they didn't know was that contempt only hardened my patience. Mr. Warren shuffled the stack of papers, aligning corners with deliberate care. His eyes flicked toward me, then toward the ivory envelope. He tapped it once gently, like a pianist touching keys before the song begins. My heart steadied at that small signal. Something lived inside that paper, something none of them expected. I looked down at the seal again, blue notary stamp firm against the ivory. My thumb brushed it rough under skin. She had told me once, patience isn't silence. It's a promise waiting for its hour. I repeated the line silently, as if to anchor myself against the sneers. The fluorescent light flickered above, casting shadows against the brown paneling. Dust motes drifted lazily, slow as tired dancers. The air smelled faintly of Lysol mixed with old carpet fibers. I let these details hold me in place. If I drifted too far into anger, I would break. If I broke, the letter would lose its power. A memory returned, the day she asked me to help organize her desk. Stacks of unpaid bills, yellowed notes, faded bank slips. She had said, they think value comes from what you hold in your hands. But true value sits in what you can carry for others. I didn't fully understand then. Tonight I did. Across the table, one cousin flaunted a check already written. 5,000, he said, waving it like a ticket. Now that's respect. Another boasted about furniture, heirlooms, jewelry. Their pride rolled like smoke, choking the air. My aunt sat taller, as if her share crowned her queen of the table. I said nothing, gripping the envelope tighter. Their pride was loud, but pride is fragile when truth appears. Mr. Warren leaned back, his chair creaking softly. We have reached the end of the will, he said. The room shifted, like horses restless in their stalls. Now, before we close, we must address the appended letter. Murmurs rippled low and wary. My cousins exchanged glances, eyebrows raised. Curiosity pricked through their arrogance. Another page, my aunt asked. She didn't mention that. That is why it is sealed, he replied evenly. A letter isn't binding, one cousin challenged. It is when notarized, he said, eyes steady. I touched the envelope's corner again, as if the paper could answer. Its silence was more eloquent than anything I could say. The mantle clock ticked once, filling the pause. My cousins fell quiet for the first time all night. The quiet brought another memory, the night she called me during a storm. Rain hammered the windows. Thunder rattled dishes on shelves. She asked me to come check the fuse box. I drove across town, water streaking down my windshield. She met me at the door with a flashlight, her face calm despite the storm. They won't show, she said softly. But I know you will. That night trust became heavier than any inheritance. The storm passed then, and the house settled into silence. Tonight's storm was different, but silence felt the same. My cousins did not know those hours, and they never would. I carried them like stones in my pocket, weighty but grounding. A cousin broke the silence. What's in it? He demanded, pointing at the envelope. Mr. Warren only said, you will hear soon enough. His calm voice carried more authority than their bluster. They shifted again, chairs squeaking against linoleum. Suspicion replaced laughter, unease creeping across their faces. The fluorescent light flickered once more, buzzing louder than before. The air vent sighed a whisper above our heads. My fingers pressed the seal, the texture rough like sand. I breathed in slowly, letting the air steady me. Their voices meant nothing now. Only the letter would matter. I thought of her final Sunday at church. She asked me to sit beside her, though cousins waved from another pew. She whispered, don't worry about their laughter. One day the paper will quiet them. Her voice echoed tonight, blending with the tick of the clock. The letter would soon open, and the silence would be hers. Mr. Warren stacked the will neatly and placed his hand on the envelope. His gesture was simple but final. We reconvene with this document, he said, pausing to let the words settle. The room stiffened. Jokes vanished. Smiles flattened. The moment shifted from mockery to tension. I folded my hands around the envelope, protective calm. My cousins stared, waiting, restless. They had gorged themselves on laughter, but now appetite turned to worry. The room smelled sharper, like ink and dust pressed together. Every detail pressed itself into memory, a record no one else kept. The valley of silence stretched deep but steady. I had no need to climb yet. The peak would come in its own time when paper rose above noise. Until then I carried trust like a shield, waiting for the letter to breathe. Keep listening. Chapter 5 will open the first pieces of evidence. Mr. Warren tapped the folder again as if to mark time. The sound was small, but it carried through the stale air. My cousins shifted, restless, their earlier laughter still clinging to the corners of the room. I kept my hands folded, envelope beneath my fingers. It felt like a seed about to sprout, but not yet. "Will note attachments," Mr. Warren said, scanning the will's margin. "The first, household receipts filed last year. The second, a list of medical expenses paid." His tone was steady, almost dry, but the words pricked the air. The room stirred with discontent. "Receipts aren't inheritance," my aunt muttered. "They don't matter. They matter when notarized," he replied. "Nobody asked for records," a cousin scoffed. "She did," Mr. Warren said simply, eyes fixed on the page. The mantle clock ticked, slow but insistent. I thought of afternoons spent balancing her checkbook while others vanished. The grocery neon buzzed overhead, receipts sliding from the printer into my hands. She trusted me to file them, to keep dates and totals intact. Tonight those small slips surfaced like stones in a riverbed. Mr. Warren spread copies across the table. Hospital invoices, pharmacy slips, maintenance bills, all stamped and signed. Each bore my handwriting in the corner, initials, dates, small notes she asked me to mark. My cousins leaned forward, frowning. They recognized my script, though none admitted it. "So you were her bookkeeper?" one cousin sneered. "I was her helper," I answered, voice calm. "Helper doesn't change inheritance," another snapped. "Perhaps not," Mr. Warren said, "but it clarifies intent." Their silence thickened. The fluorescent lights buzzed harder, like bees cornered in glass. I touched the receipts nearest me, their paper rough, ink faintly smudged. The smell of old coffee clung to them, a reminder of kitchen tables and late nights. I remembered one night clearly. She sat hunched, glasses sliding down her nose. "Write the date clearly," she told me, "so no one can erase it." I wrote carefully, each number steady. She nodded, satisfied, then folded the slip into an envelope. That envelope sat here now, part of the record. My cousins whispered to each other, voices quick, uneasy. They wanted jewelry, houses, bank accounts. Instead they saw receipts, mundane but undeniable. Their faces soured. They wanted to forget the years she struggled, but paper remembered. Mr. Warren cleared his throat. "Attached also a bank slip, small transfer dated 3 winters ago. $200 deposited under her name, withdrawn under mine. Authorized." He tapped the line. The inked stamp confirmed it. Gasps rippled sharp and fast. "You took her money," a cousin hissed. "I withdrew with her present," I said, voice level. "For groceries, not for me." "That's still suspicious," another snapped. "Not when she signed the slip herself," Mr. Warren interjected. I remembered that day. Snow piled outside the bank, boots squeaking on salt. She asked me to help her sign, her hands stiff with cold. The teller smiled gently as she stamped the slip. "200 should cover it," she whispered, then winked at me. That same slip lay now on the table, proof of trust, not theft. The air vent sighed above us, pushing cool air across my face. Dust drifted in the fluorescent light. My cousins squirmed, their confidence fraying. Receipts and slips were not what they expected. But they spoke louder than guesses. One cousin leaned close to his sister, whispering sharp. Maybe she was confused. Maybe signatures don't count. Mr. Warren looked up, glasses catching light. The notary confirmed them. Confusion is not an issue. His tone ended debate. I pressed my hand flat on the table, feeling its cool laminate surface. The envelope beneath remained unopened, yet its shadow stretched over every page. Each slip, each receipt pointed toward what waited inside. The tide was turning slowly, quietly. Another memory surfaced. She handed me a crumpled receipt once, saying, "Keep it, they won't." I tucked it into a binder. Years later, that same slip appeared tonight, fresh, stamped, part of her design. She had always known laughter would come, and she had prepared. The cousins tried one last jab. Maybe she left you scraps because you only handled scraps. Their words bit shallow now, less certain. I smiled faintly, not in triumph but in patience. Scraps can build a record. Records can build truth. Mr. Warren slid the binder forward thick with attachments. These documents will be entered in order. They carry weight. His tone was final. My cousins leaned back, silence creeping in. The room smelled of Lysol and ink, sharp official. I thought of another night carrying her receipts home in a grocery bag. I spread them across my kitchen counter, cool edge pressing against my fingers. I dated each, carefully filed them in sleeves. She trusted me to hold them. Tonight the world saw why. The mantle clock ticked again, steady as law. My cousin's eyes flicked to the envelope. Their laughter had drained, replaced with unease. The receipts had cracked their certainty. The letter would break it. I traced the seal once more, rough against skin. I thought of her last words. Let the paper speak when you cannot. That paper waited, quiet, patient, strong. Peak 2 still lay ahead. Tonight was only preparation. But preparation was power. Keep listening. Chapter 6 will open the envelope and let its voice rise. Mr. Warren adjusted his glasses, then folded his hands on the table. The will's pages sat neatly stacked, clipped in order, but every eye now fixed on the ivory envelope. For 2 chapters it had waited under my palm, dismissed as a token, laughed at as a joke. Now in the humming silence it became the center. We now address the attached letter, Mr. Warren announced. His voice was low, but it carried. The mantle clock ticked once, and even that sound felt loud. My cousins shifted in their chairs, smirks tightening into wary lines. No one laughed. The envelope had turned the air heavy. He reached toward me with steady fingers. May I? I slid the envelope forward. The surface rasped softly against the wood, a sound more final than applause. His fingertips brushed the blue stamp, rough against the ivory paper. He broke the seal with a deliberate motion, paper fibers sighing as they tore. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The smell of ink and old carpet filled the pause. I clasped my hands together, nails pressing into skin. The letter unfolded in his hands, creased lines sharp as knives. He cleared his throat, then began to read. This letter, dated and notarized, is intended as clarification to the distribution. The bequest of $200 is not symbolic alone. It is a condition. Receipt of this amount activates fiduciary authority granted exclusively to the named heir. Gasps broke across the room. Chairs scraped. Pens dropped. My cousins stared, mouths open, eyes wide. Mr. Warren continued unhurried. By accepting this sum, the heir assumes role of secondary executor with rights to oversee disbursement of the trust. No other beneficiary may alter terms without her signature. Any challenge is void unless accompanied by proof of fraud, which none exists. The room erupted. Voices clashed, sharp, frantic. This is trickery, my aunt shouted. She planted that letter, a cousin accused. How can $200 mean power? Another demanded. Mr. Warren raised a hand, his voice calm against the storm. The notary's stamp and witness signatures confirm validity. The clause is binding. He laid the letter flat, its blue stamp bright under the light. My cousins leaned forward, their earlier laughter gone. Faces flushed, brows furrowed, voices cracking. She never told us this, one muttered. She never told you, Mr. Warren corrected. She told the notary and signed in front of witnesses. 5 lines froze the moment. My ZOOM of Peak 2. Conference room, fluorescent buzz overhead. Mr. Warren held the letter steady for all to see. If they doubted me, the blue stamp would not. My breath steadied, shoulders easing. The clause speaks now, he said. The room stilled again reluctantly. The fluorescent light hummed, a cold halo above us. My aunt gripped her chair arms until knuckles whitened. A cousin muttered, this cannot stand. Another hissed, we'll contest. Mr. Warren shook his head. Contests fail without cause. The law stands with the letter. I pressed my palms flat on the table, grounding myself. The envelope lay empty now, its power transferred into words. I could still feel the flap's fibers against my thumb. She had planned this moment, set it in motion, trusted me to endure until the paper spoke. The smell of Lysol drifted faintly, clean and sharp. Dust floated through the light, slow as truth itself. I looked at each face. Their pride had cracked, their smirks vanished. What filled the air now was anger, but anger had no clause, no seal, no witness. You manipulated her, a cousin spat at me. I held her receipts, I said quietly. You pushed her to sign, another accused. I drove her to appointments, I replied, voice level. Mr. Warren spoke firmly. The letter states she acted of her own will. Witnesses confirm she was alert and deliberate. Your accusations carry no proof. He tapped the page. This is proof. Their voices faltered, overlapping but weaker. The mantle clock ticked once, filling the pause. I leaned back, exhale slow. Patience had reached its hour. The paper had spoken, not me. Another cousin tried again. $200 can't buy authority. It doesn't, Mr. Warren said. It unlocks authority she already assigned. Think of it as a key, not a price. His metaphor landed like a gavel. The room deflated slightly, chairs squeaking as people shifted. I remembered her final words in the notary's office. She pressed the envelope into my hand. When they laugh, she whispered, don't answer. Let this answer. Tonight her answer filled the room. The fluorescent light flickered once, buzzing harder. The air vent sighed. My chest loosened. Their mockery had run out of breath. My silence had survived the storm. The letter had turned $200 into the strongest voice in the room. Yet the pushback came again. She never trusted you, my aunt sneered. Then why is my name here, I asked, voice still calm. She pitied you, another guessed. Pity doesn't notarize a clause, Mr. Warren said flatly. He folded the letter once more, sliding it back into the folder. His gestures were deliberate, heavy with meaning. We proceed under this clause, he concluded. The heir has authority, that is the law. The mantle clock ticked again, louder this time, or maybe my ears made it so. I closed my eyes for a breath, then opened them. My cousins stared with resentment, but beneath it fear had joined. They had mocked, then shouted, but nothing could erase ink and seal. I touched the folder's corner gently. The letter had spoken. Authority had confirmed. Consequences had begun. The smell of old carpet, Lysol, and ink filled the room. The fluorescent hum pressed down, unrelenting. Silence grew heavy again, not with laughter but with realization. Peak 2 had landed. Their ridicule had met its boundary. Paper had closed their mouths, not mine. Keep listening. Chapter 7 will show the weight of choice after the letter speaks. The room stayed heavy after the letter's last words. My cousins leaned back, their faces flushed, their whispers sharp with anger. The envelope lay empty now, its power poured into clauses that no one could deny. The mantle clock ticked again, and the air vent sighed above us. I sat still, but inside I wrestled with weight. Authority had passed to me with $200 as its key. Yet power does not arrive clean. It comes with shadows. Their stares pressed against me, accusing, doubting, resentful. I pressed my palms against the table, the laminate cool under my skin. I wondered whether silence could still protect me or if words would now betray what paper had already secured. She must have been confused, one cousin muttered. Or pressured, another insisted. She was sharp until the end, Mr. Warren answered firmly. Witnesses confirm her intent. His words fell like stones, closing the argument before it rose. I kept quiet, but inside questions grew. Could I carry this role with dignity? Could I resist the temptation to answer cruelty with cruelty? Paper had given me authority, but paper cannot teach restraint. That must come from within. The fluorescent light flickered once, buzzing like an unsettled insect. I remembered her words in the notary's office. Patience isn't silence. It's choice. Tonight I had a choice. Would I wield this clause as a hammer or as a shield? The smell of Lysol clung to the air, sharp and sterile. I breathed it in slow. My cousins' glares burned, but they no longer laughed. Their pride had collapsed under the weight of a single letter. Now I held the aftermath, heavy and delicate. Mr. Warren stacked the papers neatly, his movements calm. The clause stands, the authority belongs here, he said, nodding toward me. The words marked me in their eyes, sealing a new identity. No longer the family's joke, but their boundary. I thought of nights when I sat at her kitchen table counting bills while she sipped coffee. She would glance at me, then at the paper, and say, "You see what they never bothered to see." I had carried her trust in silence. Tonight that silence became public. Still doubt gnawed. Would they ever forgive? Would they respect the role or fight every decision? Authority written in ink can still bruise in practice. I rubbed my thumb over the table's edge, its coolness anchoring me. You'll use this against us, my aunt accused, suddenly breaking the pause. I'll use it as written, I said softly. Same thing, she snapped, her voice sharp. Not the same, Mr. Warren said, calm but firm. Their eyes drilled into me, waiting for a flare of pride, a slip of arrogance. I gave them none. My voice stayed low, my posture steady. Inside, my heart thudded against my ribs, but I would not let them hear it. The mantle clock ticked again, marking the silence. My cousins shifted chairs, scraping the floor. They wanted another outburst, another peek, but this chapter was valley. This chapter belonged to doubt, not triumph. I remembered a stormy night when power flickered and the fuse box failed. I drove to her house, fixed the switch, and sat with her until the lights steadied. She had said then, "Quiet hands fix more than loud mouths." Those words guided me now. Authority should be quiet hands. The fluorescent light glared down harsh on paper and faces. My aunt crossed her arms, lips pressed tight. A cousin drummed fingers on the table, restless, frustrated. They could not undo ink, but they could still wound with suspicion. Inside me, another voice rose. What if I pushed back? What if I reminded them of their absence during hospital stays, their silence during winter bills? The urge trembled in my chest. Yet I remembered her warning, let paper speak. Do not drown it with noise. I steadied myself with that memory. The smell of coffee drifted faintly from the lobby machine, bitter and grounding. I inhaled, exhaled, slow. Silence stretched again, wide and heavy. I held it like a rope balancing above anger. Mr. Warren's gaze lingered on me for a moment, as if to measure my steadiness. He gave a small nod, then addressed the room. Further disputes must be handled through the court, but the clause is clear. I advise acceptance. His voice was not threatening, only final. My cousins bristled. One cousin muttered, "She doesn't deserve this role." Deserve or not, it is hers, Mr. Warren said simply. Their words had grown smaller, weaker. Their fight was slipping into silence. I leaned back, shoulders easing slightly. The envelope was empty, but its weight still pressed on me. I wondered if authority always feels this way, both a gift and a burden. She had trusted me not just to win, but to hold steady after winning. That was harder. The mantle clock ticked again, echoing in the quiet. The air vent whirred softly, a low reminder of routine. Life continued outside this room even as ours shifted within. Then she'll decide everything, a cousin asked bitterly. She will decide according to the clause, Mr. Warren answered. Their eyes turned toward me, sharp and searching. I met them with calm, though my chest still trembled. I remembered her final whisper in the notary's office. Carry this with care, not pride. Those words wrapped around me now, steadying my breath. I could feel the cool laminate of the table, the harsh light above, the faint smell of Lysol. These anchors reminded me to stay grounded. Valleys matter as much as peaks. Tonight I stood in one. Doubt weighed heavier than ridicule because ridicule had already been silenced. Now came the harder part, holding power without letting it hold me. Keep listening, Chapter 8 will bring the final crest where justice lands with warmth and clarity. The silence stretched long enough that even the buzzing fluorescent lights felt louder than breath. My cousins stared at the ivory envelope now folded back into the file. Their laughter was gone, their anger muted, but suspicion and disbelief still clung like smoke. I sat straighter, pressing both hands flat against the cool table, steadying myself. The mantle clock ticked again and the room braced. Mr. Warren lifted his glasses, then unfolded the final page. His voice clear and even carried weight heavier than any insult. This is the personal letter, handwritten, notarized and filed alongside the will. It shall be read in full. He adjusted his papers and the room leaned forward as one. He began. To my family, you will see one bequest of $200. You may think it small, even insulting. But it is not money I leave with this clause, it is authority. The words cut the air sharper than any laughter had. My cousins shifted, uncomfortable. Mr. Warren continued. I know who came to me when the porch rain tapped at night. I know who sat at my kitchen table, balancing receipts, recording dates, paying bills. That person carried weight no one else wanted. For that reason I leave authority attached to her name. Without her consent no distribution stands. Gasps spread across the room. My aunt's lips pressed thin, her eyes narrowed. A cousin shook his head, muttering, "This isn't fair." Another whispered, "She planned this," as if planning was a crime. Mr. Warren read on, voice steady. To the others I leave what I promised, but with terms. You may take what is written, but you must sign acknowledgement of her oversight. If you refuse, your portion reverts to the community trust I have established. The fluorescent light flickered, buzzing sharp against the still air. The smell of ink and Lysol pressed stronger now, as if the room itself absorbed the truth. I tightened my hands, my thumb brushing the laminate edge of the table. The clause was not just power, it was responsibility. Mr. Warren paused, then looked up. His eyes met mine, calm but direct. He nodded once before continuing. To the heir of the $200, you are not chosen for wealth. You are chosen for patience. Carry this authority without pride. Carry it with the same steadiness you carried my papers. That is my final request. The letter ended there. The silence that followed was thicker than any argument. The mantle clock ticked once, twice, and still no one spoke. My cousins stared at me, their faces flushed with a mixture of resentment and reluctant recognition. 5 lines froze the moment my final zoom. Community office, fluorescent buzz sharp overhead. Mr. Warren held the handwritten letter, high pages trembling slightly. If they doubted me, the ink would not. My chest tightened, then eased. The letter stands, he said, firm and final. The room shifted like a tide retreating. Their smirks had collapsed, their accusations lost under the weight of her words. One cousin muttered, "She set us up," but even that sounded hollow. My aunt looked at the floor, unwilling to meet my gaze. Another cousin slumped back, arms crossed but silent. Mr. Warren closed the file with deliberate care. The clause has spoken. Authority is confirmed. Consequences are clear. He leaned back, glasses resting low. Signatures will be required before disbursement. My cousins bristled, but no one challenged. They could not. Their laughter had vanished, their anger thinned, their pride deflated. The fluorescent light buzzed on, uncaring, as if the office had seen this scene before. I sat still, silence now mine. I thought of her kitchen table, coffee percolating in the background. I thought of her voice whispering, "Keep this until they laugh." I had kept it. Tonight her voice had landed. "She manipulated you," one cousin whispered sharply. "She trusted me," I replied calmly. "She punished us," another hissed. "She held you to terms," Mr. Warren corrected. His words settled like gavel strikes. The smell of old carpet, ink, and Lysol pressed steady against my senses. The mantle clock ticked again. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. The peak had passed, but its echo would linger. Mr. Warren gathered the documents, stacking them in order. He placed the handwritten letter on top, its ink still bold. "We will file copies with the court," he said. "No clause can be undone by resentment." My cousins sat in uneasy silence. Some stared at their checks, now conditional. Some stared at me, their pride crumbling. My aunt finally spoke, her voice thin. "So everything goes through you." "Through her consent," Mr. Warren confirmed. Her lips tightened, but she said no more. The fluorescent light flickered again. Dust floated in the beam, quiet as snow. I pressed my palms together, steady, patient. Revenge whispered faintly, tempting me to speak, to remind them of neglect, of absence, of years when silence carried weight alone. But her voice echoed louder, "Carry it without pride." I obeyed. I thought of another memory. The day she pressed her house keys into my hand before surgery. "If anything happens, you'll know what to do," she said. That trust had never been spoken to the others. Tonight that same trust had become law. My cousins finally began to stand one by one. Their movements were slow, heavy. No laughter, no boasts. The conference room smelled of dust and defeat. The mantle clock ticked again, closing the hour. Mr. Warren packed his folder, then looked at me once more. "You may set boundaries now," he said gently. "The law has spoken. But your choice defines the closure." His words reminded me that dignity must come from action, not paper alone. I nodded, voice low. "Then my boundary is simple. I will honor the trust as written. I will not argue, and I will not gloat. What is signed will be signed. What is refused will return to the community fund." The words landed quietly but firmly. My cousins stared, surprised by calm. No revenge, no victory speech, just terms. The fluorescent light hummed above, a cold but steady witness. I thought again of her whisper in church. "Paper will quiet them." Tonight paper had done more. It had silenced cruelty, confirmed truth, and restored dignity. My role now was to protect that silence, not break it. Mr. Warren rose, closing his briefcase with a soft click. "This session is concluded," he said. The room stirred reluctantly, chairs scraping against linoleum. My cousins gathered their belongings slower than before, their pride left behind. I stayed seated, letting the moment breathe. The envelope lay empty, but the letter lived now in every face. They would remember tonight not as laughter but as record. The mantle clock ticked again, and I whispered silently to myself, patience had carried me here and patience would carry me on. Keep listening. Chapter 9 will close with the lesson and the humane boundary left behind. When the room finally emptied, silence held me like a cloak. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, but the noise of my cousins had dissolved into memory. The ivory envelope rested inside the lawyer's folder now, its purpose fulfilled. I sat still for a moment longer, breathing evenly, letting the weight of the evening settle. $200 had sounded like an insult, a mockery meant to reduce me to nothing. Yet that same sum had unlocked authority, confirmed trust, and silenced ridicule. The lesson was not about money at all. It was about faith placed carefully, then revealed when the time was right. I thought of the afternoons when I sat across from her, receipts spread across the table, the coffee percolator filling the air with warmth. Those quiet hours never made headlines, never impressed my cousins, but they built a record of patience, steadiness, and loyalty. She saw it even when no one else cared. Tonight the letter proved she had written that truth into law. The mantle clock ticked again, steady as always. Its sound reminded me that time carries records as faithfully as paper. My cousins had mocked me for being the least, but in the end I was the one entrusted. Trust does not shout. It waits. I realized then that dignity does not come from applause or large inheritances. It comes from carrying responsibility without gloating. It comes from setting boundaries quietly without needing to wound. The law had spoken, but the harder task was mine, to hold authority without pride, to ensure her wishes lived as she intended. When the fluorescent light flickered again, I smiled faintly. The flicker reminded me that life is fragile and people forget easily. But documents like patience endure. That was the lesson she wanted me to carry, and perhaps the lesson she wanted my family to face. What is written holds longer than what is shouted. I will honor her request. I will not fight them beyond the terms. I will protect the trust, let the community fund receive what they refuse, and I will not bend to bitterness. My boundary is firm but not cruel. They may hate me for a while, but the letter will outlast their anger. I stood then, gathering my coat, steadying myself for the night air. Outside, the street lamps glowed against the quiet town. The office smelled faintly of dust and ink, but to me it smelled of closure. I carried not wealth but something stronger, dignity restored by patience, confirmed by the written word. The world will always hold people who laugh at what they don't understand. Yet laughter fades quickly when truth arrives with witnesses and records. $200 may seem small, but tonight it was everything. It was the key to boundaries, the proof of trust, and the quiet victory of dignity over contempt. If this story spoke to you, let it remind you that small sums can hide great weight, and patience often carries more power than pride. If this restored dignity, please subscribe to True Tales and continue with our Inheritance and Elder Dignity playlist, where more stories unfold, each showing how truth written clearly can restore peace when voices fail. The mantle clock ticked once more, and I walked into the night, steady, quiet, carrying trust forward.